Last month, we saw the Israeli army invade Jenin in maybe the largest military invasion of Jenin since 2002.
Mhm.
Um, and they killed many people. They attacked medics and journalists in broad daylight on camera. They have destroyed infrastructure, and it was all very painful. But I think the most compelling aspect of the raid on Jenin was what followed. Israeli soldiers at night held their megaphones and instructed hundreds of Palestinians to flee their homes. And they told them, if you don't leave, if you don't have your hand up in the air, you will get shot. And they were forced to leave their homes in the camp and walk to God knows where. I can guarantee you, because the Nakba is not that old, I can guarantee you that some people who were marching away from their camps, who were chased away from their homes in the camp in Jenin, were some of the same people who were chased away from their homes in Haifa in the first place. This perpetual exile that Palestinian people continue to live is unbearable. I mean, in my case, my grandmother was removed from her home in Haifa in 48, and then she moved from city to city. And then in 2009, she saw half of her home taken over by Israeli soldiers. My grandmother died in 2020, and 2 months later, we got the next expulsion order from the Israeli court. I'm quite ashamed to admit that I was relieved that my grandmother had died, because I did not want her, 103 years old at the time, to go through yet another Nakba. And this is the fact for so many Palestinians, regardless of where they are on the map.
If I may read the description of the situation in Jenin, and maybe you can comment. So this is on July 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Just reading Washington Post description. So this was an Israeli military incursion to Jenin. The raid included more than 1,000 soldiers backed by drone strikes, making it Israel's largest such operation in the West Bank since the end of the Second Palestinian Uprising in 2005. The Israeli military said it dismantled hundreds of explosives, cleared hundreds of weapons, destroyed underground hideouts, and confiscated hundreds of thousands of dollars in, quote, terror funds. Many of the 50 Palestinians who have attacked Israelis since the start of the year have come from Jenin camp and the surrounding area. Palestinian attacks inside Israel have killed 24 people this year. UN experts describe the Jenin operation as collective punishment, in quotes, for the Palestinian people, amounting to egregious violations of international law. Many of the more than 150 Palestinians killed by Israelis this year have also come from these communities. Palestinian fighters say they need arms to defend themselves against the Israeli occupation and military incursions into the camp, during which Palestinian civilians, including children, have been killed. So those are the, I would say, different perspectives on the many people on both sides who have been killed. Many more Palestinians. Can you comment more about this situation?
I mean, I think the Washington Post article is a little bit more, careful than other media that came out recently about Jenin. I think, I was listening to a Reuters radio show, and they failed to ever mention the occupation. I don't even think this paragraph mentioned that Jenin is under occupation by the Israeli forces, by the Israeli regime. I think this is the most important piece of context that gets obscured in our media reporting, is these cities, these refugee camps, are under illegal occupation. The Israeli army has no business being there in the first place. That is the departure point. That is the most important piece of context that will answer to you why these people are arming themselves. Many of which, by the way, lived through the 2002 massacre and bombardment of Jenin and grew up in that violence. The context that Palestine is under occupation, that these Palestinian cities are under occupation, that they have to deal with land seizures at all times, that they cannot leave their towns without a special permit. All of this will give context to the violence. And, the thousands of Israeli soldiers that raided the camp that day, that traumatized an entire generation, they think they will quell that generation. They think that with such bloodshed and such barbaric violence, destroying infrastructure, attacking medics, killing people left and right. They think with this kind of terror that they can, quell people, tell people that, you know, they can guarantee that these kids are not going to grow up and resist. But that's the opposite of what happens. One thing about Palestinian people, they will not compromise their dignity. You know, these people live in dire, excruciating circumstances. And it is so courageous, in my opinion, that they even think to defend themselves against one of the most lethal, one of the most sophisticated armies in the world, against a nuclear state that can wipe them out in the matter of seconds. But it's not, at the end of the day, it's not even about courage. It's about survival. They don't do this because, of machismo or because of heroic tendencies. It's because this is about survival.
So the degree there's violence, it's about survival.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think if there was no occupation, there would be no violence. It's quite obvious. And again, people understand this. I mean, like we saw on Twitter in the recent month, all of these Israeli propagandists who had tweeted pictures of like little girls with guns in Ukraine and like women making bombs in Ukraine and young men carrying their rifles in Ukraine and praising them as heroes, post very similar pictures of Palestinians and calling them terrorists. It's glaring, the double standard. I don't even need to linger on it.
Well, the double standard is glaring, but I also think the glorification of violence is questionable. There's a balance to be struck, of course, but
yeah, I mean, I don't think we should be glorifying violence at all. But I don't think we should be normalizing violence either.
Yeah.
I think that's what it is. I'll tell you a story. I was interviewing a person whose brother was killed by the Israeli military during a Israeli raid on their village, and the person was so concerned about whether I was going to report that her brother allegedly had a Molotov cocktail in his hand. And I found it absolutely insane, absolutely absurd that we can just glance over the fact that there is, again, a foreign military in tanks with rifles and snipers invading the village at 4 a.m. in the morning, shooting live ammunition at people's houses, throwing tear gas. That we can just glance over. It's normal. We could just report on it. No problem. Nobody's going to bat an eyebrow. But the fact that potentially somebody might have picked up a Molotov cocktail to throw it at this invading army is where we draw the line. It says a lot. It says a lot about whose violence is normalized, is accepted, is institutionalized, is glorified even, right? And you walk around Tel Aviv and you see all of the plaques plastered around the streets of the country, of the city, celebrating the battles that they had won, the massacres that they had enacted against the Palestinian people. But God forbid Palestinians have any kind of similar sentiment.
So on July 4th, during this intense period, a Palestinian rammed a car into pedestrians at a bus stop in Tel Aviv, injuring 8 people before being shot dead by a passerby. Also that night, Hamas fired rockets into Israel, and then Israel responded with strikes on what it said was an underground weapon site. So just to give some context to the intense violence happening here, what do you think about Hamas firing rockets into Israel?
Well, the framing makes it seem as though like unprovoked Hamas is like firing rockets onto Israel, regardless of what I think of Hamas, obviously, but unprovoked. But that's not the case. The provocation is the fact that they are forced to live in a cage, that they have no access to clean water, they have no access to basic rights, no access to imports, no access to anything, that they can't leave. They're living in a densely populated enclave that was deemed uninhabitable by the UN that was deemed an open air prison. So the rockets, in any case, are retaliation for the siege. Let's start there. But again, this is just to prove my point. Violence begets violence. Palestinian people are not violent people. We are not violent people at the core. And I think, what serves this narrative is Islamophobia, is like xenophobia towards Arabs, which we don't have. Like, I don't have the luxury, to write laws about. By the way, I'm quite, frustrated by this. I am preoccupied, and the Palestinian people are preoccupied with the material violence that we have to deal with on the day-to-day, the demolitions, the bombings, the imprisonment. That's what we're distracted with and busy with, that we can't even talk about the racism, the casual racism against us, the anti-Palestinian racism, be it in the media, on social media, and diplomatic circles, but all of this racism that has gone unchecked, that has not been regulated for decades, allows for these tropes to continue, in which Palestinians are promoted as these like barbaric terrorists, and the only way we could remedy that situation is by marketing them as these like defenseless victims. But the fact of the matter is not this simplistic. Palestinian people are human beings who should enjoy a full spectrum of humanity, which includes rage, which includes disdain, which includes happiness and joy and laughter, which includes celebration, which includes all of these things. But we're not allowed this. But we are doing exactly what any people throughout history who have been oppressed, who have been colonized, who have been occupied, have done and continue to do, as we see in Ukraine, which is celebrated by mainstream media. I'm sorry to keep reiterating this point, but at this point, I am quite, exhausted by how exceptional Palestine and Palestinian resistance is, when the world tells me time and time again that it doesn't have a problem with violence, it just has a problem with who does that violence.